the criminals from the war arms, from the Confederate contracts in the Civil War to overthrow the civilian government, believes that they were targeting David Bowles as economic security to remove him so that the public being destabilized will just do as they say, as the coercion of the use of policy of an unwilling participant generates an alternative state other than the civilian chosen one, which they are specifically disloyal to, assumes from these positions the systematic assaults and abuses and subversions, qualifying David being targeted for the removal of these economic advantages and social advantages from status, qualifying his active subversions. Don Bowles Sr., having actively been engaged with gymnastics, would have also been actively been training David for gymnastics, qualifying his access to snap-effect economics, the businesses based upon his horoscope as well as his base titles, such as his father's training him in gymnastics, qualifies his active development of the circus qualifiers from his gymnastics training in the performances. The cultivation of this development qualifies the assumption of some characters like Kira Sagoni, assuming some kind of definition from various people I have heard. It means something along the lines of man who eats pussy. Regardless of its actual definition, I think that we can continue in the assumptions that the general idea is that they don't want to qualify the proper representation and would actively obstruct any correct investigations. The active subversion of the usage through false titles such as secrecy qualifies their development in the cultivation of fruits of the poison tree for a fraudulent narrative. Now, the definition of the man who eats pussy, according to this assumption, is the qualifies the basic characteristics of Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, at which point the active suppression turns Tigger into ER, at which point the constant abuse and suppressions and irritant allows him to be represented as being unenergetic and unentertaining and unlikable by those who would have been presented and cultivated in the captured market as the intergenic and desirable, at which point you have the active subversion of the social norms, qualifying permanent deformations for permanent injuries, at which point you have the systematic reinforcements of permanent injuries which must be under law corrected against. Now these persistent constructs develops the assumption of this original economy from the horoscopes of the fire tiger Libra, whatever businesses might be around this. The assumption with many of them is brokerage, and the assumption of the circus is the assumption of businesses that revolves around supermodels. These developments around the supermodels in combination with the circus means there is a constant ability to have a traveling human decency, including the use of exercise equipment in order to keep health at maximum prosperity, qualifying the active development and shipment of nutrients for specialized meals on the permanent performance basis. The assumption is that he would never stop training because he would never stop performing, qualifying the higher physical development and calling the assumption of the progression of better growth. The assumptions that their abuses reduces nutrients and sleep and other things certifies the reduction of human function, such as how large the person would become from these criminal abuses, at which point there is a functionally different body. It's the smaller body qualifies the permanent injury of the criminal terrorism, the habeas corpus was supposed to protect against, but terrorists in Expo Facto generates after the fact rulings qualifying the permanent injuries for the satisfaction of the Satanists. The qualification of the developed economy qualifies the traveling human decency to wherever the businesses would have needed to have gone for the supporting qualifiers of the economy from the zombie insurance up qualifies the stability of the development of the businesses, increasing the qualifiers of the automatic purchases for said circles, qualifying the constant development of the ability for them to have maintained these advantages in previously constructed purchases, such as stand-up comedians, qualifying the active development and evolution of the entertainment market, qualifying engagements with the active obligations for traveling business duties, the development of new areas and the maintenance against various injuries or subversions which would require emergency businesses alterations, the qualifier to the active obligation to broker the various contracts requires one to make the business trips, qualifying the obligation of taking everything, uprooting it and going to see other locations, at which point you would have these actively traveling areas, qualifying our ability to engage in business as usual without the assumption of reduced human decency, at which points there is minimal stress by comparison, it would all be standard and normal. The certification of the original economy would have protected the general public from these systematic abuses such as the racism. The development of these racist abuses qualifies the active changing in the society, which gives the secret courts secret arguments for the wizards to make their abuses under the assumptions that Social Security or Medicare or some other food stamps types scenario would protect them from permanent injuries, qualifying their ability to receive the assaults despite all other negative permanent impacts, which is their current developed ambition. Now, with these covers, you have the secret arguments protecting the criminal injuries from this, which generates the defamation. The defamation being the objective of the core issue. With this scenario, you have a permanent problem, whereas if you would have the cultural problem of not being developed, as a white culture develops as prosperity and black culture develops as poverty, you have the systematic reinforcements of the criminal defamation, such as the use of the social programs in order to protect the communities, in generating the justification of the ghetto. The development of these engagements certifies the constant reinforcement of the social engineers developing terrorism for the crafting of the culture that they would be defamed for, at which point you have the constant negative cycle regressing these targeted communities for destruction. Now, if you ignore the terrorist damages against David, you are aiding and abetting the insurrection and old contracts from the current modern day society, which would have needed all of these advantages in order to have engaged in their lawful statuses, which were criminally reduced, at which points the systematic overthrow of the United States is a collective issue for everyone that cannot be ignored, and we must destroy them for the national security to exist in practice. David's position as a checks and balance against the criminal surveillance wizard program qualifies the the surveillance courts, which project themselves as above the Supreme Court, qualifying the prevention of the highest courts to be inferior to a lower court due to the case of secrecy, despite the fact that they are permanent members of the thing, at which point their lifetime tenure without bad faith would have qualified them for the access to the use of secrets, and making the courts repetitive. As the rubber stamps criminal engagements, there is no rigidity due to their specific KKK crafting of their Druid mechanism of this social engineering, such as the manipulation of the vote through the systematic terrorism for voter fraud, qualifying the protection of their criminal wizard mechanisms for the use of civilian abuses as an agenda in and of itself is a functioning permanent black market. The use of the criminal coercion in order to engage in the manipulation of presentations, such as the reduction of news, such as David Bowles' National News Corporation, which engages whatever the name would have been, but it would have been National News, at which point the 24 National News would systematically be reporting for David Bowles as his interest in general from the generic perspective of the truth, for his political and social and other ambitions, such as the function of his brokerage, which would actively update his economic systematic plots, at which points the planning of the development of the economy and its most firm security qualifies the Civil War terrorists as having to remove these economic innocent qualities in order to make the abuses against their more vulnerable public. With the development of these assaults, you have the coercions, you have the manipulations of the scenarios, such as the reduction of human decency, such as the active access to what is to be said, at which point you have the use of abuse and coercion to prevent the function of the work, at which point you have a lower income and other disadvantages, such as the removal of normal social arrangements, at which points the original associates, not having access to him, would then not be able to develop any kind of culture. For the systematic genocide of David Bowles as a culture and society is one of their fundamental goals, as it is systematically a war on David, at which point you have the systematic destruction of checks and balances and national security of the United States, qualifying as international tragedies, David Bowles having been projected on what was supposed to be the courts protected schedule, would have engaged in systems that they projected would have saved Europe from various injuries which would have been developed, which is systematic part of War on David. For the European treaties would have been actively aspects of his kingdom, which he would have started from their schedule where the Europeans are stable. The developments of this position qualifies the collapse of Europe, at which points you have the systematic supports from the globalist economy, at which points the globalists want to have engaged in the subversions of plans of debilitations of foreign assets within the American government to overthrow the United States for a great reset, at which points the systematic strategy qualifies the contest between the two of them, where Europe has been developed to have been removed from having David, at which points Europe is planned to be on collapse, at which points the collapse of the Europeans after the Great Reset qualifies the American KKK overthrow of the United States for the Confederacy, at which points the advantage and stretch of the all territories involved in the Great Reset would be under Confederate control, and the development of these positions qualifies their ability to systematically place the one world government under revelation generating the peoples from the courts with the proper economic treaties and other advantages necessary to assert a one-world government, at which point the use of nerve hacking and other surveillance versions qualifies the target to be replaced by the spirit of Satan, qualifying your Antichrist, qualifying the trap in order to engage in the various other genocides, such as the genocides of the Jews, which is supposed to religiously trigger the second coming of their God, qualifying the Antichrist equipment in order to kill the Jewish God, at which point you have the functional agenda of these Soviet Nazi psychopath terrorists. Their goals don't really seem anything. If you have the systematic position of their villain who is trying to destroy the world, the question becomes, where will you live?